It didn't begin with headlines, it began with silence. A silence so deliberate, so tightly controlled, that even seasoned palace aides refused to speak above a whisper. When Princess Beatrice quietly withdrew her name from a long-standing royal charity, the move seemed procedural. But behind that decision lay a discovery so unsettling, so damaging, that it threatened to unravel not just reputations but trust at the very heart of the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the palace moved with practiced precision, issuing what many interpreted as a routine explanation, carefully framing the withdrawal as part of an ongoing restructuring process. On paper, it sounded harmless, even expected. Royals, after all, adjust their patronages frequently, shifting focus as priorities evolve. But those familiar with the inner workings of the firm began to notice something that didn't quite align with that narrative. The timing felt abrupt, the language unusually vague, and most telling of all, the absence of the usual ceremonial acknowledgement that accompanies such decisions spoke volumes. Reports suggest that behind closed doors, the atmosphere had shifted days before the announcement, turning tense, almost brittle, as if something fragile was on the verge of breaking. Insiders whisper that the urgency surrounding Beatrice's withdrawal wasn't driven by strategy but by necessity. Conversations that were once routine reportedly became tightly controlled, with access limited and documentation handled with unusual caution. It is said that certain financial summaries had begun circulating among senior advisors, raising questions that no one was prepared to answer publicly. These weren't loud accusations or dramatic revelations, at least not yet, but quiet inconsistencies, subtle enough to be dismissed individually, yet impossible to ignore when viewed together. And as those inconsistencies began to form a pattern, the sense of unease deepened, spreading through the corridors of royal administration like a shadow no one could quite define. Those closest to the situation describe an environment where even seasoned aides were instructed to hold back, to say less, to avoid speculation entirely. That level of restraint, by all accounts, was highly irregular. The monarchy thrives on controlled transparency, carefully curated, yes, but rarely silent. Silence, in this case, became its own kind of signal. It hinted at something unresolved, something still unfolding behind the scenes. And while the palace maintained its composed exterior, the internal pressure was building, quietly but steadily, as more questions surfaced without answers. Meanwhile, beyond palace gates, the media began to take notice. Journalists who had initially overlooked the story as routine started revisiting public records, examining filings that suddenly seemed less straightforward than they once appeared. Small discrepancies, timing gaps, unexplained adjustments began to draw attention. Not enough to confirm wrongdoing, but enough to raise suspicion. And in the world of royal scrutiny, suspicion alone can ignite a firestorm. The narrative was beginning to shift, slowly but unmistakably, from administrative change to something far more complex. As speculation grew, the palace's carefully constructed silence only amplified the intrigue. Every unanswered question became louder, every withheld detail more significant. What had started as a quiet, almost invisible withdrawal was now gaining momentum, pulling more attention with each passing day. And at the center of it all stood Beatrice, her decision no longer seen as routine, but as a deliberate step away from something she could no longer stand behind. But what began as a quiet withdrawal would soon expose something far more troubling, an internal breach no one saw coming. For years, the charity stood as a symbol of royal goodwill, polished, respected, and deeply embedded in the monarchy's public image. But beneath its carefully curated exterior, questions had begun to surface. Questions about money, about oversight, and about whether the institution had quietly drifted from its founding purpose. What made this particular organization so significant was not just its charitable mission, but the legacy it carried. Established under the quiet patronage of senior royals decades earlier, it was designed to reflect the monarchy's promise of service, an extension of duty beyond ceremony, beyond tradition. It wasn't merely about fundraising or public appearances, it was about reinforcing a deeper connection between the crown and the people it served. Over time, the charity became a trusted fixture, drawing support from influential donors, corporate partners, and long-standing benefactors who believed in its cause. Its annual figures were substantial, its reach impressive, and its reputation, for many years, untouchable. At the center of that reputation stood Princess Beatrice, whose involvement had been both visible and consistent. She wasn't just a ceremonial figure attached to the organization, she was actively engaged, lending her voice, her presence, and her credibility to its initiatives. Those familiar with her work often described her commitment as genuine, rooted in a belief that royal influence should translate into meaningful impact. Her appearances at events, her speeches, her quiet advocacy behind the scenes, all of it helped elevate the charity's profile, reinforcing its image as a modern extension of royal responsibility. And for a time, that image held strong. But institutions built on trust are also vulnerable to scrutiny, especially when the stakes are high. As the charity expanded, so did its financial complexity. Larger donations brought greater expectations. Partnerships introduced layers of administration. And with growth came a system that required careful oversight, something that, according to various reports, may not have kept pace. Early signs of imbalance were subtle. Internal reviews reportedly flagged minor inconsistencies, the kind that might easily be attributed to clerical error or delayed reporting. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediately alarming, but enough to raise quiet concern among those tasked with maintaining accountability. It is whispered in administrative circles that these early warnings did not receive the attention they deserved. Whether dismissed as routine anomalies or lost within the broader scale of operations, they lingered, unresolved. Over time, those small irregularities began to form patterns that suggested something more than simple oversight. Financial timelines that didn't quite align. Allocations that appeared inconsistent. Reports that, while technically complete, left critical questions unanswered. None of it was overtly explosive on its own, but together, it painted a picture that was increasingly difficult to ignore. The charity's prominence only intensified the stakes. Because this wasn't just about numbers on a page, it was about credibility. Royal charities operate under a unique expectation, one that goes beyond legal compliance. They are seen as reflections of the monarchy itself, symbols of integrity and purpose. Any hint of mismanagement, however small, risks undermining that perception. And as murmurs of irregular accounting patterns began to circulate more widely, the pressure mounted, quietly but relentlessly. For Beatrice, the implications were deeply personal. Her association with the charity meant that any questions directed at the institution inevitably brushed against her own reputation. And while there was no immediate suggestion of direct involvement, the connection alone was enough to create unease. Those close to the situation suggest that this growing tension between public image and private concern was becoming impossible to reconcile. What had once been a source of pride was now shadowed by uncertainty. The very foundation that had sustained the charity's success, trust, transparency, and purpose, was beginning to feel fragile. And as more attention turned toward its financial structure, the narrative shifted from admiration to scrutiny, from confidence to doubt. And as investigators began looking closer, the numbers told a story no one inside the palace could ignore. It wasn't one missing figure or a single misplaced entry, it was a pattern. A pattern that suggested something deeper than error. Something systemic. And as internal reviews turned into formal scrutiny, the scale of the irregularities began to take shape. At first, the discrepancies revealed themselves in fragments, numbers that didn't quite reconcile, timelines that seemed slightly misaligned, reports that raised quiet questions rather than loud alarms. But patterns, once noticed, have a way of demanding attention. And what had initially been treated as routine anomalies began to evolve into something far more concerning. According to those familiar with the process, internal compliance teams started tracing financial flows more carefully, comparing records across reporting periods, searching for clarity where there was none. It was in these deeper examinations that the cracks widened, exposing inconsistencies that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The issue, as insiders suggest, wasn't simply about missing funds or clerical oversight, it was about allocation. Money appeared to move in ways that lacked clear justification, redirected through channels that were technically permissible but increasingly difficult to explain. Some transactions raised eyebrows because of their timing, others because of their scale. And then there were the entries that seemed to exist without context, appearing suddenly in reports without the supporting documentation typically required for transparency. None of it amounted to a definitive conclusion on its own, but together, It formed a troubling mosaic, one that hinted at deeper structural weaknesses within the organization's financial management. As concern grew, the involvement of external auditors became not just advisable, but necessary. Reports indicate that independent reviews were quietly initiated, bringing in specialists tasked with examining the charity's accounts without internal bias. Their role was not to accuse, but to clarify, to determine whether what had been uncovered pointed to error, negligence, or something more deliberate. And as those reviews progressed, the language surrounding the situation began to shift. What had once been described as inconsistencies started to be framed as unexplained gaps, a subtle but significant change that carried far heavier implications. These gaps were not always dramatic in isolation. A delayed report here, an adjusted figure there. But when mapped across months, even years, they created a timeline that felt incomplete, as though key pieces of the story were missing. Financial reporting, by its nature, relies on continuity, each entry building upon the last, forming a clear and traceable narrative. But in this case, that narrative appeared fractured. And for those responsible for safeguarding the charity's integrity, that fracture was deeply unsettling. Within royal administrative circles, the atmosphere reportedly shifted once again, this time from concern to quiet alarm. The issue was no longer confined to internal discussion, it was beginning to carry broader implications. Because if the irregularities were as systemic as they now appeared, the question was no longer just how they happened, but how they were allowed to persist. Insiders began to hint at possible governance failures, suggesting that oversight mechanisms may not have been as robust as they should have been. Whether due to complacency, complexity, or misplaced trust, something within the system had failed to catch the warning signs early enough. And as that realization took hold, the stakes grew even higher. This was no longer just about financial discrepancies, it was about accountability, about responsibility, about the invisible structures that are supposed to protect institutions from exactly this kind of uncertainty. The deeper investigators looked, the more it became clear that the problem was not confined to a single moment or decision, but woven into the fabric of how the organization operated. And that is what made the situation so difficult to contain. Because systemic issues do not point to easy answers, they raise difficult questions. Questions that reach beyond numbers and into the realm of leadership, decision-making, and trust. Questions that, once asked, cannot easily be ignored. But the real shock wasn't just the financial gaps, it was who might be held responsible for letting them happen. Those close to Princess Beatrice say the decision didn't come lightly. Loyalty had always guided her public role, but this time, loyalty collided with principle, and what she chose next would send a message far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. By the time the findings reached her, the atmosphere surrounding the charity had already shifted from quiet concern to something far more unsettling. Reports suggest that Beatrice was briefed in private, away from formal settings, in conversations that carried a weight few could ignore. These were not routine updates or minor clarifications, they were detailed explanations of the discrepancies that had been slowly emerging, laid out with careful precision. Those familiar with the exchange describe a moment of realization, not immediate, but gradual, as the implications began to take hold. What she had long supported, what she had publicly stood behind, was now under a level of scrutiny that raised uncomfortable questions. And for someone whose role had always been tied to trust and credibility, that realization was deeply personal. It is said that a series of internal meetings followed, involving senior advisors, legal consultants, and those tasked with navigating the increasingly complex situation. These discussions were not simply about damage control, they were about choices, about what it meant to remain associated with an institution facing such uncertainty, about the balance between loyalty to a long-standing cause and responsibility to uphold the standards expected of a royal figure. Insiders whisper that the tone of these meetings was measured but tense, with no easy answers and no clear path forward. Every option carried consequences, and every delay risked allowing the situation to escalate further. Her reaction, according to those close to the matter, was one of deep concern, not panic, not outrage, but a quiet, deliberate unease. The kind that comes from understanding the gravity of a situation without yet knowing how it will unfold. She was said to have asked questions, not just about the figures themselves, but about the systems behind them. How had this gone unnoticed? Who was responsible for oversight? And perhaps most importantly, what would happen if the full extent of the irregularities became public? These were not questions driven by self-preservation alone, they reflected a broader awareness of what was at stake, not just for her, but for the institution she represented. The decision that followed was not immediate, but when it came, it was decisive. Withdrawing her support was, in many ways, a statement quiet in execution, but powerful in meaning. It signaled a refusal to remain aligned with something that no longer met the standards she was expected to uphold. It was not framed as an accusation, nor as a condemnation, but as a step taken in the interest of integrity. And yet, the timing of that step raised its own set of questions. Why now? Why at this particular moment, when the investigation was still unfolding? For observers, the answer seemed clear. The situation had reached a point where silence was no longer sustainable. Within the palace, efforts were reportedly made to manage the narrative, to present the withdrawal in a way that minimized speculation and maintained stability. Language was carefully chosen, statements were deliberately restrained, and the emphasis remained on continuity rather than disruption. But beneath that controlled messaging, the reality was far more complex. Because Beatrice's decision, however quietly executed, had introduced a new dynamic, one that could not easily be contained. It had drawn a line, however subtle, between association and accountability. And that line changed everything. What had once been an internal issue was now moving into a broader spotlight, carrying with it implications that extended beyond a single charity. Because when a royal steps away, it is never just about the act itself, it is about what that act represents. It raises questions. It invites scrutiny. It shifts perception. And in this case, it suggested that the situation was more serious than anyone had initially been led to believe. Her departure wasn't just symbolic, it triggered a chain reaction that the palace could no longer control. Within hours of the news breaking, the palace machine shifted into motion. Statements were drafted. Language was softened. But outside those gates, the reaction was anything but controlled. The official response, when it came, was measured to the point of restraint. Carefully constructed phrases spoke of ongoing reviews and organizational adjustments, avoiding any direct acknowledgement of the growing concerns that had already begun to dominate public conversation. It was the kind of statement the monarchy had perfected over decades, calm, neutral, designed to steady rather than inflame. But this time, the distance between what was said and what was being whispered felt unusually wide, because by now, the narrative had already slipped beyond palace control, carried forward by a media landscape that thrives on unanswered questions. Across the UK press, scrutiny intensified almost immediately. Publications began revisiting the charity's financial history, examining past reports with a sharper, more critical eye. Journalists who had once covered its events with admiration were now probing its structure, its leadership, its oversight mechanisms. Reports suggest that even long-standing royal correspondents, typically cautious in their tone, are often more cautious in their tone than others, began to hint at deeper concerns, framing the situation not as an isolated issue, but as part of a broader pattern that demanded attention. And as each new article added another layer of speculation, the pressure mounted, building a narrative that was becoming increasingly difficult to contain. The public reaction followed closely behind, shaped as much by uncertainty as by fact. For some, the news triggered concern, a sense that something fundamental had gone wrong within an institution they had trusted. For others, it sparked criticism, questioning not just the charity itself, but the systems that allowed such irregularities to remain unnoticed for so long. And then there was speculation, relentless and evolving, filling the gaps left by official silence. Social discussions, commentary, and opinion pieces began to converge on a single theme: accountability. Not just for the organization, but for those connected to it. At the center of this growing storm stood the charity's leadership, now facing mounting pressure to respond. Silence, once a strategy, was quickly becoming a liability. Calls for clarity grew louder, not only from the media but from donors, partners, and observers who had supported the organization for years. Questions that had once circulated quietly were now being asked openly. What had gone wrong? When did it begin? And perhaps most critically, who had the responsibility to prevent it? These were not questions that could be answered with carefully worded statements alone. They demanded transparency, something the situation, as it stood, had yet to provide. For the royal family, the stakes extended far beyond a single charity. This was about perception, about credibility, about the delicate balance between tradition and modern accountability. Royal patronages are not merely symbolic, they are reflections of the monarchy's values, its commitment to service, its connection to the public. Any challenge to that image carries wider implications, threatening to erode trust in ways that are difficult to rebuild. And as comparisons to past controversies began to surface, moments when silence and delay had only deepened public skepticism, the urgency of the situation became impossible to ignore. Because history has a way of shaping expectation. Previous crises had shown that perception can shift quickly, that trust, once questioned, does not easily return. And now, with attention fixed firmly on this unfolding issue, the monarchy found itself navigating a familiar but deeply uncomfortable space, caught between maintaining composure and addressing growing demands for accountability. And as scrutiny deepened, attention turned to a more unsettling question: how far did the problem really go? The charity wasn't operating in isolation. Behind its polished image stood a network of trustees, advisors, and financial handlers, some known, others less visible. And as investigators followed the trail, new connections began to emerge. What had once appeared to be a straightforward structure, clear roles, defined responsibilities, layers of oversight began to reveal a far more intricate system beneath the surface. At the top were the trustees, individuals entrusted with safeguarding the charity's mission and ensuring its integrity. Beneath them, a web of advisors and financial managers handled the day-to-day complexities, managing funds, coordinating partnerships, and overseeing distribution. On paper, it was a system designed for accountability. But as scrutiny intensified, that very structure began to raise uncomfortable questions. Because complexity, while necessary for growth, can also obscure clarity, and in this case, it seemed to do exactly that. Investigators reportedly began mapping relationships within the organization, examining not just roles, but connections. Who reported to whom? Who approved what? And perhaps most importantly, where lines of responsibility may have blurred. It is whispered that certain individuals linked to financial oversight held overlapping roles, positions that, while not inherently improper, created spaces where independent checks could be weakened. These weren't obvious breaches of protocol, but subtle alignments that, over time, may have reduced the system's ability to self-correct. And in an institution where trust is paramount, even the appearance of such vulnerabilities can carry significant weight. As this network came into focus, attention turned to the charity's external partnerships. Over the years, it had built relationships with a range of organizations, corporate sponsors, private donors, collaborative initiatives, each contributing to its expansion and influence. But with those relationships came additional layers of financial interaction, each requiring careful oversight. Reports suggest that some of these partnerships were now being re-examined, not necessarily for wrongdoing, but for clarity. Were funds being allocated as intended? Were agreements being followed as outlined? And were all parties operating with the same level of transparency expected of a royal-affiliated institution? These questions, once peripheral, were now central to the investigation. The deeper investigators looked, the more the issue seemed to shift from isolated discrepancies to systemic concerns, because if the governance structure itself allowed for ambiguity if roles overlapped, if oversight mechanisms were not as robust as assumed, then the irregularities uncovered earlier were not anomalies. They were symptoms, indicators of a system that may have gradually drifted from its original design. And perhaps most troubling of all were the reports suggesting that early warnings had existed, quietly noted but not fully acted upon. Internal concerns, it is said, had been raised at various points, hinting at inconsistencies that warranted closer attention. Yet for reasons that remain unclear, those warnings did not trigger the level of response now unfolding. This realization added a new dimension to the situation. It was no longer just about what had happened, but about what had been missed or possibly overlooked. Accountability, in this context, became more complex. It was not confined to a single decision or individual, but extended across a network of roles and responsibilities. And as that network came under closer examination, the sense of unease deepened. Because systemic issues are rarely sudden, they develop slowly, often unnoticed, until a tipping point forces them into view. And that tipping point, it seemed, had now been reached. The narrative was shifting once again, moving beyond immediate concerns to a broader, more unsettling understanding of how the situation had evolved. What investigators were uncovering suggested this wasn't a sudden failure, but something that had been building quietly for years. For the monarchy, charities are more than goodwill, they are a cornerstone of public trust. And when that trust is shaken, the consequences reach far beyond a single organization. Because for generations, royal patronages have served as a bridge between institution and public, a way of transforming symbolic power into tangible impact. They are not simply endorsements or ceremonial affiliations, they are statements of value, reflections of what the monarchy chooses to stand behind. Each charity connected to the crown carries with it an unspoken promise that it operates with integrity, that it serves its purpose without compromise, and that it upholds the standards expected of an institution built on tradition and duty. And when even one of those connections is called into question, the ripple effect can be profound. As the situation surrounding the charity deepened, that ripple began to spread. Concerns about financial irregularities were no longer confined to internal discussions or investigative reviews, they were now intersecting with a broader issue of credibility. Because transparency, once doubted, is not easily restored. Reports suggest that within royal administrative circles, conversations quickly shifted toward risk, how to contain it, how to address it, and how to prevent similar issues from emerging elsewhere. This was no longer just about resolving a single case, it was about protecting the framework that supports the monarchy's public role. Insiders indicate that internal discussions grew increasingly focused on oversight, examining whether existing systems were sufficient for the scale and complexity of modern royal charities. Questions were raised about governance structures, reporting requirements, and the balance between trust and verification. It is said that proposals began to circulate quietly at first, suggesting tighter controls, more frequent audits, and clearer lines of accountability, not as a reaction to crisis alone, but as a necessary evolution in response to changing expectations. Because in a world where scrutiny is constant, even long-standing traditions must adapt. At the same time, a subtle but noticeable shift began to occur among senior royals. While no direct statements were made, there were signs of careful distancing and an adjustment in tone, a recalibration of association. Public appearances connected to the charity became less frequent, references more restrained. It was not a dramatic withdrawal, but a measured step back, designed to preserve stability while acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. For figures like Princess Beatrice, whose involvement had already become a focal point, this shift reinforced the sense that the issue had moved beyond containment into something far more consequential. The long-term implications of this moment were impossible to ignore. Royal patronages, once seen as enduring partnerships, now faced renewed scrutiny. Observers began to question how such affiliations were monitored, how accountability was enforced, and whether the existing system could withstand the pressures of modern transparency. What had been accepted as a stable and trusted structure was now being reassessed, not out of choice, but necessity. And with that reassessment came a broader realization that the relationship between the monarchy and its charitable work was entering a new phase, one defined by heightened expectations and reduced tolerance for uncertainty. Calls for accountability grew louder, not just from the media, but from the public itself. There was a sense that this moment required more than quiet adjustments, it demanded clarity, openness, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Because trust, once shaken, cannot be rebuilt through silence alone. It requires action, acknowledgement, and above all, consistency. And as those calls continued to build, the pressure on the institution intensified, pushing it toward decisions that would shape its future. But even as reforms were discussed, one reality had already become clear: the damage had been done. There was no dramatic speech, no public confrontation, just a quiet withdrawal and a message that echoed far louder than words. Princess Beatrice had stepped away, but the questions she left behind were only just beginning. By the time her decision settled into public awareness, its finality was impossible to ignore. There were no reversals, no clarifications, no attempt to soften its meaning beyond the carefully measured statements already released. What had been framed initially as procedural now carried the weight of something far more deliberate. Those who had followed the unfolding situation understood that this was not a temporary pause or a strategic adjustment, it was a line drawn, quietly but unmistakably. And in the world of royal associations, where continuity is often prioritized above disruption, such a step signaled that the situation had reached a point from which there was no easy return. The charity itself now stood at a crossroads, its future uncertain in ways that would have seemed unthinkable only months earlier. Once buoyed by strong patronage and public confidence, it now faced a reality shaped by scrutiny and doubt. Ongoing investigations, both internal and external, continued to examine its operations, its governance, and the irregularities that had first triggered concern. Reports suggest that these reviews were far from complete, their outcomes still unfolding, their conclusions not yet fully formed. And in that uncertainty, the organization found itself navigating a delicate balance, attempting to maintain its purpose while confronting the very issues that had called its credibility into question. For the monarchy, the implications extended well beyond this single case. This moment had exposed vulnerabilities that could no longer be overlooked, forcing a deeper reflection on how royal patronages are managed, monitored, and sustained. Lessons, though not always publicly stated, were clearly being absorbed. The need for stronger oversight, clearer accountability, and more transparent structures had moved from abstract discussion to immediate priority. Because if this situation had revealed anything, it was that trust once assumed must now be actively protected. And that protection requires more than tradition, it demands vigilance. At its core, the story had evolved into something larger than financial discrepancies or administrative failure. It had become a test of responsibility of how institutions respond when faced with internal challenges that threaten their external image. For Beatrice, the choice to step away reflected one kind of response. A decision rooted in principle, shaped by the understanding that association carries weight. For the institution, the response was still unfolding, shaped by the need to address concerns without destabilizing the broader structure it represents. And between those responses lay a tension that would continue to define the narrative long after the immediate headlines faded. The broader conversation surrounding royal accountability had also shifted. What had once been discussed in cautious terms was now being examined more openly, with greater expectation for clarity and action. Observers, both within and outside traditional circles, began to view this moment not as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger evolution, one in which the monarchy must navigate the demands of modern transparency while preserving its historical identity. It is a balance that offers no simple solutions, only ongoing adjustment and, at times, difficult decisions. And so, what remains is not just the outcome of an investigation, but the echo of a choice. A quiet withdrawal that spoke volumes. A series of questions that continue to linger. And an institution now tasked with proving that it can adapt without losing the trust upon which it depends. Because in the end, it wasn't just about one charity, it was about the fragile line between duty, trust, and the cost of silence. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.